tall people may live further in the past than short people because they have to wait for the signals all the way from their toes before they put together their unified perception. Okay, but how does your brain know how to put all these signals together? So to think about this, let's turn to the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, who reigned from 1260 to 1294 and founded the Yuan dynasty. Now, he had conquered the largest kingdom the world had ever known. His kingdom reached from the Pacific to the Black Sea and from Siberia to modern-day Afghanistan. His territory covered a fifth of the world's inhabited area, so it was absolutely enormous. He situated himself in what is modern-day Beijing. And the thing to note is that this was back in the day before iPhones and telegraphs and trains or email or anything like that. And so the question is, how in the world could Kublai Khan know his own empire? There's no way he could travel even a tiny fraction of a territory that large in his entire lifetime. So how could the great Khan know what his empire contained? The answer is he hired emissaries like the Venetian traveler Marco Polo. And these people would travel out to the distant reaches of his empire, and they would convey news back to him about what was going on in the empire. And he hired many emissaries that would go out in different directions and bring news back to him about what was going on. Now, I've never heard a historian talk about this, but I imagine the great Khan must have faced a tough problem. What events in his empire occurred in which order? Because of wars and weather and other issues, people might travel at different paces. So the different emissaries would come back to him at different times. One emissary comes back and reports that a war has just ended. And another emissary comes back and reports that a war has just begun. And they're talking about the same war, but they got back to the capital at different times. And so the question is, how did the great Khan synchronize all these signals? The thing I want to make clear is that the timing problem Kublai Khan had is the same problem the brain has, which is to say, it's getting all these different streams of information that come in at different paces. And because your brain is locked up in the dark tower of the skull, its only contact with the outside world is via the electrical signals exiting and entering along the highways of nerve bundles. So you've got touch information streaming up the body, you've got auditory coming in, you've got visual information coming into the brain. But the issue is that all of these things get processed by the brain at different speeds and at different places in the brain. So your brain faces this enormous challenge, how to stitch together the incoming signals in the best way to make a story about what just happened in the outside world. For example, as we just saw, when I clap my hands, the auditory signals get processed first, then the visual signals, and yet they seem synced up. What this tells us is that the brain is somehow pulling off major video editing tricks, and we're going to find out how. Now, my lab has studied this for years, and the first thing to appreciate is that your brain doesn't figure this out passively. It does this by involving your own actions. Your own actions are the secret to understanding how everything gets synchronized. And what I've proposed is that your brain goes through so much trouble to get all this timing right because of one issue, causality. Because one of the most fundamental things that any animal does is figure out whether it was the one that caused something or not. And fundamentally, judging what caused what requires looking at the order of events. So imagine you're walking in the forest and you make a step and you hear a twig crack. You can assume that was because of you. But if you hear the twig crack just before you land your step, then you'd better be worried about a mountain lion. So causality requires a temporal order judgment, which is to say, did I put out the action and then I got sensory feedback, in which case I'm going to take credit for having done that, versus I got sensory feedback and then I did some action, in which case I'm not taking credit for that. I had nothing to do with that. And what we're often talking about is tens of milliseconds one way or the other as the only difference between these scenarios. But animals are very sensitive to this. And at bottom, this is the challenge that animals have to figure out.